Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, Mal got to meet plenty of stars in Los Angeles and marveled at Burt Lancaster's home. He also had a chance, thanks to Paul, to speak to Elvis. Mal was always his #1 fan. He also had to deal with the fans and their mothers, and no wonder he was often exhausted. So let's see what's going on today. Once the Beatles did their shows in Toronto and Montreal, the tour went briefly to Key West, where the Beatles rode out Hurricane Dora. On September 11th, they played Jacksonville's Gator Bowl. During a flight to Massachusetts for the September 12th show at the Boston Garden, Mal was sitting next to Kane at the rear of the plane, and he broke down in tears. He told the reporter that John got kind of cross with me and just said I should go F off. No reason, you know, but I love the man. John is a powerful force. Sometimes he's rough, if you know what I mean, man. But there's no greater person that I know. Before Kane could figure out what had happened between the two men, he caught sight of John approaching Mal and embracing him. In mid-September, Mal would have a memorable experience at Cleveland's public auditorium. He said, "I arrived as always in the afternoon to set up all the equipment, and upon looking at the main electrical supply for equipment, I found there wasn't any. I immediately collared the promoter and asked what was about the electricity for the stage. He turned to me and said quizzically, 'They play guitars, don't they?' He really thought they all played acoustic guitars and didn't need it. There then followed a frantic hour of tying cable together to supply the stage with power. The real problems occurred during the gig itself when the boys found themselves in near riot conditions. Mal wrote that the tour was one made up of kaleidoscopes of sights, sounds, and the inevitable hot dogs, and at all the shows except one completed. And this one was in Cleveland when the police insisted upon stopping the Beatles halfway through their act as thousands of kids rushed on the stage. One girl explained to me later it was because they couldn't see from their seats, which were behind pillars. A few days later, the Beatles and their entourage made an unplanned stop in Kansas City, Missouri, after promoter Charlie Finley offered the unheard-of sum of $150,000 for the band to perform at the Municipal Stadium, home of Major League Baseball's Kansas City Athletics. There was lax security, and things really came to a head the next day in Dallas, where the city's police department requisitioned only 2 policemen on motorcycles to combat the thousands of fans awaiting the Beatles at the airport. As we touched down, Mal remembered, the police officers disappeared beneath the stampeding fans who gave us the fright of our lives as they climbed on the wings of the plane as we taxied in. How somebody wasn't killed is beyond me. The lack of effective crowd control continued after the show at the Cabana Hotel, where a girl was pushed through a plate glass door. They had a charity concert slated for New York City, where they would close out the tour on September 20th. The Beatles traveled to a remote ranch in the Ozarks to enjoy a few days off. By this time, Mal needed a break, not only from the tour, but also from the Beatles. He wrote later, "As much as I loved them, joining them at a ranch meant that I would still be working." Mal set up at the Riviera Idlewood Hotel in Jamaica, Queens, where there were supporting acts staying there. Mal befriended one of the policemen assigned to the tour's security detail. Together they bonded over one of Mal's favorite pastimes. Mal said, "I have always been a Western fan, fascinated by guns, for they are not available in England." To his delight, the officer took me around all the gun shops where I bought a Western holster. I had great fun walking around the hotel with the holster on, the cowboy hat, and packing a replica 6-shooter. The pistol would be the first entry in the roadie's gun collection, which he proudly displayed in his family's Mosley Hill home. By September 21st, the boys and their entourage were winging their way back to England, and the Beatles grossed $1.2 million, an incredible sum at that time for a rock and roll tour. Looking back after the American tour, Mal noted each of us lost 1.5 stone, about 21 pounds in sweat. They had gotten close to scandal, but they emerged unscathed and possibly wiser. For Mal and Neil, the boundary lines were slowly being redrawn in some instances. Derek Taylor later recalled a minor scrape between Brian and the boys over their in-flight seating arrangements. Mal, Neil, and Derek typically flew economy, while Brian and the Beatles sat in first class. Derek remembered one instance during the tour when the bandmates sent Brian to economy to fetch their support crew. "He came through to economy to get Mal and Neil and me into first class," said Derek. "He was sent there by the Beatles, actually." "What are they doing back there? We made a effing fortune on the tour. Get them up here. You go and get them." In truth, traveling first class, Mal and Neil had little reward. They were expected to provide the band with services. The Beatles knew of the importance of the roadies to their success story, and Mal and Neil's job-related duties grew, but the money they made from it didn't. George Harrison later recalled the weekly wages the Beatles enterprise grossed at the beginning of Beatlemania prior to the band's 1964 tours. George said, "From the starting figure of £72,000, we made £4,000 each. Brian Epstein took $2,025 a week, and Neil and Mal got £25 each." By the time the band and their entourage got back to England on September 21st, the Beatles lost Derek Taylor. He resigned after an incident with Brian Epstein at the Riviera Idlewood Hotel. In some ways, it came down to the interpersonal jealousy, especially regarding FaceTime with John, George, Paul, and Ringo. Tensions had been running high between Brian and Derek for some time. Derek infringed on Brian's authority and the manager's personal limousine and rode with the boys back to the hotel. Brian responded by screaming at Derek, who promptly quit. Taylor said, "I'm not taking any more of this man's SHI, you know what I mean. I love the Beatles, but I'm not hanging around to be fired another 100 times. I'm off." He was replaced by 28-year-old Tony Barrow, who ran the PR division for NIMS. Tony was known by Mal and the Beatles, and he had come up with the band's Christmas fan club releases, and he was the writer responsible for coining the popular nickname the Fab Four. Mal's sister said that after he got back home from the United States, he was worn out and shattered by the tour. He had lost weight, and he had started to compartmentalizing his life. She said her brother and the Beatles were living in a totally unreal world, an extraordinary, horrendous, wonderful, terrible place that they were all existing in during that period, and they were damaged by it. They suddenly could have anything they wanted. October 1st, a new employee joined the band. His name was Alf Bicknell. He was 35 years old and became the band's chauffeur. His weekly wage was £30, which is about £496 in present-day pounds, and this gave a well-deserved pay raise for Mal and Neil in order to be fair in the boys' inner circle. Alf understood his role. He was part driver, part bodyguard. Alf said, "I took a lot of pressure off Neil and off Mal. Mal was busy with the musical instruments." Alf was a timely addition to the Beatles also, because Mal later earned yet another ticket, his third moving violation, and briefly saw his driver's license suspended. There were a few weeks before the Beatles were set to begin an autumn tour of the United Kingdom, and George Martin got them into the studio to record their next album. Mal was there when they had a session at EMI Studios on October the 18th. George was anxious to keep them on a roll, a term he had for the Beatles' run of consecutive #1 singles in their homeland. From Please Please Me through A Hard Day's Night, the roll stood at 6. I Feel Fine seemed like a surefire bet to grow that number even more. For most of the session, Mal sat in a corner, and he replaced guitar strings and read a detective novel. Mal said, "This is when you get proud of them. They can be difficult, but when you see how good they are, you forgive them everything." Mal recognized the essential work that he was doing, also carrying out for the band's behalf, especially when it came to keeping them fed. It allowed them to work longer hours in the studio. And during a recent session, John had said, "We need some tea," only to look up and see Mal ambling into Studio 2 with a beverage service. "You got to be a mind reader in this business," Mal said. Even though Barrow and Bicknell were added to the team, Mal's job duties were about to expand again. He was to become their all-around fixer and also marijuana procurer to his responsibilities. Since they had met Bob Dylan and he introduced the Beatles to marijuana, they had an appetite for it. Mal and Neil got good at rolling the cigarettes and maintained a ready supply for their employers. In the United Kingdom, cannabis had been rendered illegal in 1928 as an addendum to the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920, and growing the plant had been outlawed in 1964, which put the Beatle roadies in jeopardy should they ever be caught trafficking in the stuff. George Martin, from the start of the sessions, knew the band was up to something. At EMI Studios, they always used to disappear and have a little puff, but they never did it in front of me. They always used to go to the canteen, and Mal Evans would guard it. As the Beatles' marijuana use grew more frequent, Mal would discreetly roll joints behind Ringo's drum screen in Studio 2 in order to maintain a steady supply. As early as October 1964, marijuana was so prevalent in their lives that it started to get into their music. Paul managed a reference to it into She's a Woman, recorded that same month as the B-side for I Feel Fine. John later recalled that we were so excited to say, "Turn me on, you know," about marijuana and all that, using it as an expression. Mal wanted to organize the UK roadies into a more cohesive, cooperative unit. He wanted to get his colleagues into a bona fide union. He got the idea from his disgust at the amount of work it took to tear a stage show down, not to mention how angry it made him when other roadies went out of their way not to cooperate. John Fanning, former manager of Ted Taylor and the Dominoes, and now the road manager for the Sounds Incorporated, and one of Mal's closest friends, recalled an occasion when they had been finishing setting up, and of course the Beatles were topping the bill, and one of the London groups with a couple of flash roadies started to set up in front of us and push some of our amps out of the way. I told them if it was me, I wouldn't do that. As the other roadies watched in a kind of stunned silence, Mal quietly walked over, looked at what they'd done, picked up one of their amps at arm's length like it was a piece of tissue paper. Then he walked to the edge of the stage, helped the amp out, and let it go, dropping it about 15 feet, where it broke into several pieces. They got the message. Mal wanted to avoid such conflicts in the future and came up with an idea. I had in mind to form an association of road managers, the aims of which were basically to place the groups on stage, fully equipped and on time so they could perform their job, which was to entertain the public. Things like breakdowns of group vans, equipment, and the problems of having equipment, and the problems of having equipment stolen, and road managers going sick, could be rectified easily and quickly with the aid of such an association. He made inquiries with petrol companies to see about issuing credit cards for members of the association, while also looking into providing a nationwide 24-hour replacement and maintenance service for vehicles and gear. Unfortunately, the response from most road managers was purely selfish, he discovered. All they were interested in was shorter working hours, more money with paid holidays, which was not the point of the RMA, Road Managers Association, at all. A road manager's lot is not an easy one, and there's not too many who work just for the money involved. It's one of those strange occupations that you have to dedicate yourself to, for you spend many hours traveling, not only handling all the equipment, but devoting yourself to the group generally. By October, the Beatles and their entourage were back on the road for an autumn tour that would transition into a series of Christmas shows. This time it was to be held at Hammersmith Odeon. October 21st in Glasgow, Mal and Brian had a disagreement. Mal had been forced by local police to park a distance from the venue. He and Neil devised what they thought was a reasonable plan, where Neil would keep an eye on the gear while Mal went to get the van. And Mal arrived backstage as the Beatles were making their exit with an escort that included hundreds of police officers. As he walked into the dressing room, Mal said that Brian really let blast at me, saying that I had deserted his boys and put them in danger by not being there. At one point, raising his hand to strike me, his face red with anger. I'm afraid that I stood there and nearly laughed, not at his sincerity, but at the thought of him hitting me. Mal started to visualize the headlines if he had gotten into a fight with Brian. He said the difference in size between Brian and I would not have done him any good at all. But it did please me to no end that even with all the police protection the Beatles had, Brian still wanted me at hand to look after them. I have an extremely high tolerance level, and it takes a lot for me to get angry. The Beatles were aware of the tensions Mal experienced on their behalf, often joking, "We've never pushed you to your limit, have we, Mal?" For his part, Mal didn't know what would be the instance that would have him throw up his arms in disgust and exit their lives forever. So I will end the video here. In this episode, we see that Mal finally got some help when a chauffeur was hired to drive the Beatles around. This let Mal do his other duties, such as taking care of the musical instruments and getting the Beatles their food. Mal could be hurt by John and his remarks, but he loved him. He also had Brian get on him from time to time, but it never reached the point where he walked away like Derek Taylor did. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. I want to wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.